Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for another opportunity to come together and fellowship with other Christians. Help us to take this opportunity and really look into the Word and use this opportunity to better ourselves, to go out in the future and impact other people in a positive way. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for all the many blessings you put in our lives. We're thankful for you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, good evening. It's good to be with you tonight. Somehow I drew Esther chapters 1 and 2. I'm not sure how that worked out, but that's what we're going to do. I don't know. I just did. Well, kind of. So turn with me, please, to Esther chapter 1. We're going to be in chapter 1 and chapter 2 this evening. Before we get into it, I want to tell you that some of the things we're going to talk about are just challenging from a theological standpoint. They're just difficult for us to deal with, and that's okay. It's okay for us to have things with which we wrestle and things that we just can't put a fine point on sometimes about what happened back then. That's okay, because the New Testament is complete and understandable for us today. We know concretely how we're supposed to live today. We know what the objectives are today. So the fact that it was challenging in a different time may be so, but we can understand God's Word today. And I'm saying all that because of what we're going to get into and how all of this works. So in Esther, we're talking about a time frame that's, as you can see on the screen, about 485 BC to 465 BC, right along in there. So someone refresh my memory. Approximately when was it that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians took control of Jerusalem initially? That's the Assyrians. 600 is 605-ish, and then the 586 BC, about 100 years prior to Esther's time, is when things just totally fell apart in Jerusalem. So we're about 100 years after that, and 100 years after that means that the Persian kingdom is dominating the whole area. And so the story here happens in Susa, one of the Persian capitals. They had about 4 of them. They had about 4 capitals because as they would take over different parts of the world over there, they would establish a citadel, a capital, if you will, in various parts that they took over. And one of them was in Susa. And so you can read that in verses 1 and 2. We're introduced in verse 1 of Esther to the king Ahasuerus, or Xerxes would be another name for him, and we're familiar with him. And so it says that he reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, and his citadel or his capital was in Susa. So that kind of gives us the time frame and what we're talking about. Now, what we're going to do is just kind of work our way down through the story quickly, talk about some things, and then I have a list of lessons for us to keep in mind. So chapter 1 really gets into the king celebrating the king. That's really what it's all about. This is at a time when God's people, herein called the Jews, more than just about any other book in the Bible, they're called the Jews over and over and over again. So the Jews, God's people, are still in captivity, and some have already gone back with Zerubbabel. You remember that? They've already gone back. These are the ones who remain. And it's kind of a low time. It's a difficult time for them because they're still in captivity, and Xerxes here is the king, and he wants everybody to know it. And so for 180 days in Esther chapter 1, 180 days, he's telling everybody how good he is, and he's showing everybody how good he is. And it just goes on and on. Verse 4, he displayed the riches of his glory, his royal glory, and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. So that's the climate. That's what's going on with the king. He's telling everybody how awesome he is. Then, the last 7 days, we have this banquet. He throws a big banquet. And one of the interesting things about this in verse 7 is he's serving wine with no rules and no limits. Apparently, typically, he was the one who established rules and limits, but here, there are no rules. It says in verse 8, it was done the way he wanted it done, and everybody could just have whatever they wanted to have. And so you end up with a whole bunch of folks who've been doing a whole lot of drinking. The Queen Vashti, we'll call her, she's got her own banquet going on somewhere else. So you remember how the story goes. You have the king and all of his folks together, and he says to his folks, go get me my queen. I want everybody to see her. Well, they go to get the queen, and the queen says what? I'm not coming. Not going to do it. Well, he gets upset about that, furiously enraged, and he turns to some of his so-called wise men, beginning in verse 13, who understand the times. That's what the New American Standard says. They understood the times. Anybody's read a little differently there? In verse 13, they did what? Do what? Who knew the times. Okay, so the idea is they're in tune with what's going on and the way things ought to be. Now, you talk for a minute. What's their advice? Succinctly put, what's their advice? How do they advise the king? Get rid of the queen, number one. We got to get rid of her. She's a problem. She was told to do something and she didn't do it. And what's their logic of getting rid of the queen?
All the leaders and all the men in the province or wherever will follow. They'll have problems with their wives. Their wives will follow suit and act in the same way that the queen has.
Yeah, their concern is if the king's wife can tell him no, then what? Everybody's wife can tell them no, and we're not going to have that. That's the attitude, and that's the logic. And McKinney's having a conversation back there I don't want to get into. That's pretty serious, I think. We're not doing that, is the attitude. Yeah, well. So the king hears all of that, verse 21, and he says, that's good, let's do it. And so the proclamation, read along with me in verse 22. So he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to its script, and to every people according to their language. And here's what the proclamation said: that every man should be the master of his own house, and the one who speaks in the language of his own people. So the man's in charge, what the king said, and the folks in the house are going to speak the language the man speaks. All right. He fixed that problem, didn't he? Solved that right up. And of course, that's one of those cases where he made really easily enforceable rules, right? We can follow that up and easily enforce that, right? No, we cannot. That's the climate, again, the attitude, that's what's going on, not just in Susa, but all around the province, which is fascinating to me. That you would take a problem that happened over here, in your mind a problem, and then you would make it everybody else's problem, but that's exactly what they do. Well, out of that, we go to chapter 2 and verse 1. Chapter 2 and verse 1, after the king settled down, he started to miss his wife. I guess that is verse 1 easily summed up that way. After he settled down, he started to miss his wife. Grant, you okay with that reading? That makes sense? But we have a problem because we've already gotten rid of the queen. And we've already told everybody that we're getting rid of the queen. And so his wise men, his attendants, verse 2, say, okay, we're going to find a new one. We're going to have what we might call some sort of a pageant. We're going to parade a bunch of them in here, and we're going to let him pick. So that's what they do. And Esther gets caught up in that. Esther apparently was described in the text as a very beautiful girl. And so she gets caught up in that process and ends up going to the capital and ends up, of course, then in the group. And as chapter 2 develops, she kind of stands out. And the head eunuch, the one who is tasked with presenting these girls to the king, he really likes her. And so she gets a little bit of preferential treatment there. And the way the story plays out, the king, when her time comes to go see him, the king likes her too. And so she ends up being the queen. Verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So Esther has now become the queen. Then he throws a banquet for her, and in all of this, Mordecai, her uncle, if you will, Mordecai, he has told her, don't tell him you're a Jew. Don't say a word about that. That could be a problem. At the very end of chapter 2, Mordecai, outside the gate there, outside maybe what we might call the courthouse or the palace, he hears that some folks are planning to assassinate the king. And so he tells Esther, who tells the king on behalf of Mordecai, and the plot is foiled, and all of that seems to be just fine. That's a really quick summation of chapters 1 and 2. Now, just a couple of things by way of introduction before we get to some of the lessons I want us to discuss, and we do need to discuss some things. First one is the whole book highlights the continued importance of the Jewish people in God's plan. This is a book, and we'll get to it, of providence. This is a book of God dealing with God's people, even though God isn't mentioned one time. It's a fascinating thing. God isn't mentioned one time. The king is mentioned like 167 times, either by name or by reference. The king is mentioned a lot. It really is a book about the king, but it is a book about how God is delivering and dealing with his people, and it shows us the importance of the Jews in bringing about whom? Jesus, yeah. So we never lose sight of that. Another thing is it provides an example of how Gentiles viewed and treated the Jews. That what you see here is representative of what has happened to them before and what will happen to them again. The Jews have never been the favorite people. Is that fair? They've never been the group that everybody just loves. They've always been different. And because they chose to be different, they have become targets. And it's always been that way for them. And so we see a little bit of that playing out here with Haman in subsequent chapters that we won't get to tonight. Last thing I want to emphasize is it demonstrates the providence of God. Even though God's not mentioned, over and over again you see God providentially dealing with his people and helping his people. And that to me is really encouraging. It is a low time for them. They're in captivity. They've been there a while. Some have gone back. These remain, and it would be really easy for them to get to thinking that God has forgotten about us and God doesn't care. Maybe one of the little lessons that we get out of this is when we don't see God doing anything, when we don't see him doing anything, that doesn't mean he's not doing something. He's always God. He's never not being who he is. And so what that leads us to is I don't have to be constantly seeing him do something to trust in him. I trust in him because of who he is. And he does what he does because of who he is. Even though this was a difficult time for them, God was still God and providentially was still taking care of them. So what I want to do now is just go back to the first part of chapter 1 and just kind of work down through it. I just have, 5 or 6 lessons that we want to get out of these 2 chapters, and you'll have an opportunity to participate if you would like to do that. Anything before we get into the beginning lessons? Yes, sir.
At the risk of throwing you a curve,
Mm-hmm.
is there anything to be made of God using part of His children that we wouldn't consider in a discussion of the remnant, so to speak, that has returned back to their homeland? And that's kind of the way I view this. In other words, Mordecai and Esther, for some unknown reason, weren't returned back with Nehemiah, Ezra, and those folks.
Mm-hmm.
Why are they still here? And is this providentially something that shows us that even though they didn't get to go back, so to speak, they're still valuable in the kingdom?
I think so, and I think it also helps us with location doesn't determine standing before God. They could be who they needed to be in Susa, just like Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel could be who they needed to be in Jerusalem. That's a good thing. Not yet, but they will. To our understanding, Esther probably doesn't. She's going to stay there. Right. We've got Zerubbabel having gone back, now this, and then Nehemiah and Ezra are going to go. And to Mark's point, they're going to make the journey back and be a part of what we consider to be that remnant that went back. But the remnant is not necessarily location-based. We tend to think of it that way. But the Jews who remained could still be God's people and could still be pleasing to God. And to me, that's a helpful thing for us. God's in more than one place. That kind of reminds us of the discussion with the woman at the well and the kingdom of God. And is it just this holy mountain that matters? And what's the result of that? Well, no, God is where? Out of that discussion, where is God and where is the kingdom going to be? It's in each one of you. That's kind of how that works. So good for us to consider. Okay, so just a few little lessons for us. The first one is an easy one for us to consider. Verses 1 through 11, the point I want us to talk about is being merry with wine does not honor God. That's what we see. Look down at your Bible there in verse 11. That's where he orders them. But it says in verse 10 that the king was merry with wine. What does that mean? He was lit. Say that a different way, would you? What does that mean? Intoxicated? Yeah, he was under the influence. No question about it. He's under the influence. And that just does not honor God. I would suggest to you that you're going to have a hard time finding a circumstance where someone is under the influence and they are at the same time honoring God. I can find examples where they're under the influence and not at all honoring God. Not just here, but what about in this time period? Can you go back just a little bit in recent history from here and find a time, maybe in the book of Daniel, when folks were merry with wine and God visited them? Can you think of what I'm thinking of? Yeah, the writing on the wall in Daniel chapter 5 of Belshazzar. Yeah, everything's great. He's happy as he can be. He's having a wonderful time. He brings out what? The vessels from the temple, yes, and uses them in his merriment, and God pays him a visit. Yeah, that's not a good thing. And so you can kind of look back and see some other things. Some examples I wrote down that might be helpful for us. Genesis 19, Lot and that terrible situation. Lot was in that situation because his daughters caused him to do what? Get drunk. That's what happened. That's why Lot and his whole family were gummed up, because he allowed that to take place. And that's how all that came out, yes. And I've often wondered, you have an account in Mark 6 there of Herod's daughter dancing before him. Y'all remember that? And what did that eventuate in? What happened there? John the Baptist was killed, was murdered because of all of that. And there is no specific reference there to them being drunk. But It wouldn't surprise me because of the occasion and the dancing and all of that. Might be. But it doesn't matter because there's sufficient evidence in the text that we don't need to be merry with wine. A lot of times we refer to Proverbs 23. Might want to turn over there with me. It's close to where you are. When you look at Proverbs 23, it's pretty plain and simple. You turn to Proverbs 23, and while you're doing that, I will read to you out of Proverbs 20, one verse. You go to Proverbs 23, I'll read Proverbs 20. Verse 1 says, "Wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler, and whoever is intoxicated by it is not wise." Most of us read that and we nod our head and we understand that because we see that all around us, and then we think a little bit deeper about it and we say, okay, one of the challenges every one of us has is being wise, being sober-minded, making good decisions. We're arrogant if we act like we're the only ones who always make good decisions. We don't. We all struggle with that from time to time. And so then anything that's going to cause us to be impaired in our decision-making process just throws fuel on the fire and creates a bigger circumstance for us. So Proverbs 23, is everybody there? Proverbs 23. Remember, this is the section where he says, who has woe, verse 29, who has sorrow, who has contentions, who has complainings, who has wounds without cause, who has redness of eyes? Who is it that has all these challenges? He says, those who linger long over wine, those who go to taste mixed wine. Then instruction, verse 31, instruction. Do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. Why not? Verse 32, at the last it bites like a serpent, stings like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things, and your mind will utter perverse things. You'll be like the one who lies down in the middle of the sea, or like the one who lies down on the top of a mast. That is to say, you'll be out of control. You won't know where you are or what you're doing. That's the result. That's where it takes you. Now, one thing that I have heard several times when I have brought up this passage is, yeah, but that's in the Old Testament. Is it in the Old Testament? Is Proverbs 23 in the Old Testament? Okay, does that matter? Why not? Why doesn't it matter that it's in the Old Testament? We're not under the old law, are we? I kind of lobbed that one at you. Do what? Okay, is this a part of the old law? That's a tricky question. Is this old law? Is it a part of the Old Testament? Is it old law instruction? I'm asking. Don't think so? Why not? Why wouldn't you think so? If it's not a part of the old law as far as a canonization of the law of Moses, then what is it? Biblical truth. What else? Wisdom. What kind? Divine? Yeah. Who's doing the talking presumably here? Solomon is from whom? Okay, so is this God's view of what wine and strong drink does? Is that fair? This is heaven's view of what it does. Okay, so if this is heaven's view of what it does, can it be Old Testament only?
I'm thinking it's good advice any way you look at it. I mean, we know that that's what's going to happen. And it's good advice coming from an inspired word. So.
Is it advice only?
No, but we could look at it that way.
Okay. The way I tend to view the Proverbs, and really the Psalms as well, the wisdom literature generally, is it is divine truth given to us from various perspectives. It just is that. It has to be that if it is inspired. It can't be less than that if it is inspired. But those books are not what we would consider to be the canonized law of Moses. In other words, the Ten Commandments and following. What this is a collection of truth, divine truth, and instruction for those who want to be pleasing to God. Now, there may be some things in there that relate to the old law, the law of Moses specifically, and if that is so, let that be. That's not a problem. but there is also mixed in just simple truth. Let me give you another example of that in the Proverbs that I think might be helpful to us. If you go back over to chapter 5 in the Proverbs, and where he begins with, "My son, give attention to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding, that you may observe discretion, and your lips may reserve knowledge." And then he begins to talk about, in verse 3, the adulteress or the temptress. Is that old law information that has no bearing on us today? Somebody go, no, that's not. No, that is divine truth about how temptation comes, and particularly about the ability and power the female has to tempt the male. That's just what he's saying. And he goes on in quite a bit of detail. And he says, you're going to have to be careful about this. You're going to have to be wary and aware about this. It is timeless divine truth. And none of us would read that and go, that doesn't mean anything to me today. That's old law business. No, it's not old law business. It's divine truth for all time. And we can understand that. And the same is true for Proverbs 23. Yes, sir.
Paul reiterates about being a drunkard or being given a bunch of wine, groups it in with a number of other kinds.
Well, you're getting a little bit ahead of me, but it may be time to move on. I think that's good. Grant's right on track. The New Testament is full of information about don't be a drunkard. Well, how do you do that? How are you going to be drunk? Okay. Oh. So if we hook, don't be a drunkard. By the way, let's go ahead and run some references real quick. Somebody look up Ephesians 5 and verse 18 for me. Somebody, and if you look it up, you're going to have to read it. So look up Ephesians 5:18. Somebody get Galatians 5:21 for me. Somebody else get Romans 13:13 for me. Okay, who's got Ephesians 5? Say it out loud. We're coming in the middle of these verses. No problem, you can handle it. Go with Ephesians 5.
NASB. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit.
Okay. How about Galatians 5:21? Anybody have that? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these, I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God.
Very good. Anyone have Romans 13:13 for me? Somebody's got something back there. Anybody have Romans 13:13? Go ahead.
Let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality, sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy.
Okay, so we mentioned drunkenness several times, and it's prohibited, right? Just like sexual immorality is prohibited and all of that. How do you get drunk? Yeah, you drink. You drink alcohol. That's how you get drunk. In the context of what they're talking about, and really the idea is you don't lose control of who you are. Well, the way we get to that point is we start drinking. So what if I were to tell you that I have complete control over myself and I know when to stop and everything will be fine because I know when to stop? What would you say to that? Tell me two things you'd say. Think about it. Two things you'd say to, I'm under control. Listen, somebody else may have that problem, but I've got it under control. I will never have that problem because I will never drink to excess. Therefore, I will never be drunk. Therefore, I will never, ever have a problem with those passages that we read about drunkenness. Okay, pride goeth before destruction. Okay, that's a good one. How do I know that? Well, that's just what I happen to think. Have other folks thought that before and had problems? Why, surely they have. And the impairment process is a process that, and you know this, it gradually occurs so that there is a point at which I am no longer making the decisions I thought I was making, and gradually I get to a place where I just can't make any decision at all, yet I think I'm doing fine. There was not too long ago, and I mentioned this in the sermon, not too long ago, some commercials on TV about don't drink and drive. And what they did is they showed a fellow go into the men's bathroom at some place where he'd been drinking, and he's looking in the mirror, and he's got his car keys in his hand, and he's thinking, I can drive, but the guy in the mirror is talking back, going, I don't think you need to be driving. And I believe they thought that was a good commercial. I thought that was a terrible commercial because when you're in a slightly impaired or somewhat impaired or impaired at all circumstance, you don't think reasonably. There is not a part of you that can remain sober if you're not sober. And so, to Randy's point, when I say to you, I'll never have that problem. That's not a problem I'll have. I've got everything under control. One of the first things you ought to think is, okay, but heads up. Because a lot of folks have thought that. A lot of people have said, won't be my problem. Tell me something else you think about when I say, I can do that. I won't have a drunkenness problem. Tell me something else.
Well, I thought about the verse in Isaiah, woe to those who rise early in the morning, that they may run after strong drink, who tarry late into the evening, as wine inflames them.
Isaiah 5? Yeah. It's a process that takes on a life of its own, and it's hard to shut it off. Look, the world we live in proves that to us. You ever been at a ball game with somebody who's lost control because they're drunk? How does it work when you say, hey, would you have a seat? You seem to be a little out of control. Do they all of a sudden go, oh, you're right, I believe I am. I'll just have a seat and be quiet. We lose our ability to self-regulate. What else would you say to me? I'll never have a drunkenness problem. I can handle a little bit of it. What else would you say to me? What are you after? That's a good question. What are you trying to accomplish here? What are you trying to accomplish? Not a bad one at all. What's the goal? Where do you think this is going to eventuate or end up? What are you planning for this? Okay, what else? Huh? I'm a nut. Yeah, I'm lying through my teeth. Okay, please, you got to be reading my mind. Lead me as close to temptation as I can possibly get? Okay. Awesome. We're out of time on this one. The other thing I think about is, how am I helping everybody else? Am I providing an example that's helpful for everybody else? What if I'm right and I would never get drunk? What if I'm right? There's a whole lot of folks that may not be able to do that. I don't think I'm right. But even if I were right, have I influenced negatively all kinds of other folks? And so, when you combine all the information, New Testament, Old Testament, divine truth on the subject, what we say is, don't look at it. The Proverbs 23 reference is valuable. Don't look at it, because if I don't look at it, I want what? If I don't look at it, I want what? I won't have a problem with it. If I don't look at it, I won't have a problem with it. Okay, we got to move along. Verse 12, sometimes saying no is the right thing to do. The Queen Vashti, said, no, I'm not going to do it. A lot of folks want to say, well, here's why she said no. She didn't want to parade herself around half naked in front of all those drunk men. Maybe that is the case. I don't know. That's the challenging part about this. I don't know exactly what she was asked to do. What I do know is she said, I'm not going to do that, and suffered consequences. And you and I need to be okay with that sort of thing. We need to have the courage about us to say no to some things. I'm not going to do that, and I'll suffer the consequences. I'm not going to play in that game. I'm not going to go down that road. I'm not going to do that. We need to have that courage. Yes, ma'am.
Also, she was throwing a party too, so you know
She was doing her own thing, and that's why we don't need to lift her up or anybody and say, "Ooh, look how great she was." I don't know why she said no. It might have just been inconvenient for her. I don't have any idea, and nobody else does either, honestly. The idea I'm after is, don't be afraid to say no. If it's not going to help you get to heaven, say no. Don't worry about it. Move along. Another point is, we need to check our motives and adjust if necessary. This is an ongoing thing for Christians. This is not a you problem or a me problem. This is an us problem. We always have to check our motives. The end of chapter 1, you've got these men making these decisions about what proclamation they're going to send out, and we've got to keep these women under control, or we're going to have all sorts of problems and all of that. Their motive isn't, let's do what's best for the country, for the provinces, for the king. That's not their motive. Their motive is what is best for them in their personal circumstance. What do they think is best for them? And listen, everybody struggles with that from time to time. Maybe there's an exception where you never ever have that issue, but most folks have to check their motives from time to time. They needed to do that. They did not do that. They needed to do that. We're moving as fast as we can because I want to get to these other things. It's important that we have these conversations, even if we have to go a little bit late. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, godless societies often create ungodly circumstances. You agree with that? It just happens. It happens. And what we saw in Daniel is different than what we see here. In Daniel and his 3 friends said, we're not going to eat the king's food. We're not going to do all that. We're going to stand above all of that. We're not going to bow down and worship. We're not going to do all that. And they were willing to take that stand. And how did it work out for them? Great. Was God with them? Absolutely. But they had to deal with it. Godless societies create ungodly circumstances for you to live in. What I really want you to think about is it's totally different when you get here with Esther. In verses 8 through 16, Esther did not take Daniel's position. Now, I'm not saying everything Esther did was wrong. Don't misunderstand me. What I am saying is Esther was different. And she handled things differently. Let me just be real clear. Esther, a Jew, married an uncircumcised Gentile. Didn't we just have some lessons in Nehemiah and Ezra about you can't marry those people? And if you are married to them, you have to dissolve that marriage. Didn't we just have those lessons? Esther presents us with some real challenges to understand where she was and how she did what she did. And Mordecai is implicated in the process as well, no doubt about it. I'm not saying that everything they did was wrong. What I'm saying is they had to make some tough choices. And the choices they made are different than the choices Daniel made. Now, here's what I want you to answer. Is God's involvement different with them? Did God reject the one and save the other, save the one and reject the other? Is God's involvement different to your understanding of the text? Let me ask that in a simpler way. Did God rescue Daniel and his friends? Reasonably so. Does God rescue Esther and Mordecai? Reasonably so. Okay. The world in which she lived and the circumstances she was thrust into were difficult. We would consider it slavery. We would consider it human trafficking with a sexual component added in there. It's just terrible. When you read through it, if you're not struck by these young girls having to go live in this part of the palace and then go see the king whenever he calls and then be sent back, they show up and they're in the New American Standard referred to in verse 12 as a young lady who goes in and she comes out and she's put where? With the concubines. That's, her world has changed now. That's where Esther was. And the point on the screen is God's people have to do the best they can. And sometimes there are circumstances where you might make a different decision than someone else would. That may be the case. Now, the difference for us is we have a very clear law of morality in the New Testament. Is that fair? Would you agree with that? Regarding marriage, specifically, regarding physical relationships and physical intimacies, do we have clear language in the New Testament that guides us? We do. How do we do with that overall? Humanity first. How does humanity do with that overall? Bad. Kind of like this, right? Whatever you want to do, however you want to do it. How do God's people do with that? Yeah, a little better from time to time. Do we try? We're trying, right? Do we know what the standards are? Don't act like we don't know what the standards are. And don't act like because Esther could marry a Gentile and go in one night and not go in the other night and somebody else go in the next. Don't act like that pertains to you in your life. It does not. It does not regulate you one bit. It happened. But that's not the circumstance we're living in. And we don't need to act like it is. Yes, sir? Yes, sir. We have the same sentiment throughout the whole thing. Is Esther overall doing what God wants her to do? Overall. She's playing a role. God's not mentioned here. Have I said that before? God's not mentioned in this book. But is God in this book? Do you see the challenge you'd have if you're going to write a commentary about it and address every bit of the detail? There are some challenges. What I want you to understand is let that be so. Let it be so. If you can answer it, that's fine too. But let it be that Esther became the queen and wife of a Gentile who was not circumcised. That's what she did. And that God used that, last thing on the screen, God used that for His purpose. But don't ever get to thinking that because Esther did this or that, you and I can do this or that. Or because the king, Xerxes, did this or that, you and I can. Don't ever do that. And I know you wouldn't, but I think it's good for us to be reminded. We have a very clear morality presence in the New Testament, from one end to the other, about the expectations. And let's not be dishonest. We don't always meet that. God's people struggle with that sometimes. We're not going to struggle with that because we think we can live like there's no rules. And we're not going to struggle with it because we don't talk about it. God's marriage laws in the New Testament are clear, and they are restrictive, and they exclude certain arrangements and relationships, just like God's laws did under the law of Moses. In fact, what we might say, even though it's hard in Esther and a few other places, what we might say is God really hasn't changed much at all on laws of morality, Old Testament to New Testament, has He? Some particulars, some how to do things have changed. But what you see in Genesis chapter 2, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, the two shall become one flesh. What you see there is what you see in the New Testament. How do we know that? Jesus literally said it in Matthew 19. Okay? I wish we could have spent more time on that, but
I've often
it's
wondered, in the Savior's lineage,